Hello, everybody. About a year ago, in October 2023, we did a show on what was called the repressive power of artificial intelligence with a researcher at Freedom House in Washington, D.C., Kian Vestensen, on the crisis of freedom on the internet in 2023. It was based on the Freedom House report. It's an annual report, Freedom on the Net. There wasn't a lot of freedom, at least according to Kian. And we're back again with a year later with the 2024 Freedom House report on Freedom on the Net 2024. And as always, it's not a particularly cheerful story. This report is entitled "The Struggle for Trust Online." One of its reporters or writers, researchers, is Allie Funk. She works with Freedom House. She's based in Brooklyn, New York, and she's joining us. Allie, anything to be cheerful about in 2024? Or is it about as miserable as it was last year, your Freedom on the Net report?
Well, first, thank you for having me, Andrew. We're always lovely to talk with you, and thanks for covering the report. It's a lot of bad news. I mean, the 14th consecutive decline of internet freedom. We've got really egregious rising violence. That's something we detail, increased censorship, content manipulation around elections. But we do highlight some actually really good stories. I mean, we added 2 countries this year. We added Chile and the Netherlands, which brings us a total of 72 countries that we cover. Chile is 3rd in the world, which is really exciting. And we identified some strong best practices from that country. And then more broadly, you know, one of the main things we look at in this report this year is the impact of false and misleading information on election integrity and on people's fundamental freedoms.
I haven't heard that one before.
I know, right? You've never heard that term before. You've never seen the issue of disinformation. It's all new to you, I'm sure. But we actually detail some really good best practices from a few countries about how to tackle that problem while respecting free expression. So, you know, it's a lot of bad stuff, but I think it's really important that we also highlight what's working and what could give us maybe 1 year an improvement in internet freedom.
Well, you guys are wonderful at putting beautiful graphics together about building trust online and dealing with some of those things. We'll come to that in a minute. I'm also interested in talking about Chile. I'm doing a speech in Chile in Santiago in January, so I'm sure that my friends in Chile will be thrilled with this news. But more broadly, Allie, the last year you focused on AI. I mean, you could have done it again this year. If anything, 2024 is a bigger year for AI than it was in 2023. Why do you focus on the issue of trust? Why do you entitle the report this year, "The Struggle for Trust"? There's always been a bit of a struggle. What has happened to make trust so paramount in 2024?
I think I love this question because I think if you read the report, it doesn't immediately pop out trust, right? So why did we choose that? We went in this year with the research question of wanting to understand, you know, billions of people went to the ballot box. How did all of these elections impact the information environment? And what we found is so much censorship. You know, there were 41 different countries in the ones we covered that either held or prepared for elections this year. In 25 of those, there was censorship, website blocks, total blocks on social media platforms, or internet shutdowns in full. And in 21 of those countries, there's evidence of pro-government commentators manipulating the online information. And in so many of these cases that we identified, the goal of the censorship or the goal of the influence operation was to undermine trust in democracy itself, to try to, claim that democracy is not the best governance system for undermining people's or for protecting people's freedom, or that the election itself was rigged, or that you can't trust the opposition party, so therefore you need to trust us, the incumbent. And that just popped up in so many different countries. And then, going back to what I said about some of the good stuff, a lot of what we saw policymakers or civil society or even tech companies try to do is, get people to have confidence again in the information they come across, whether that's on a certain platform, whether that's within their media environment. So again and again, and what we were finding, it came back to trust. And when we're thinking about what do you need for a democracy to function, you have to trust the people in power. You have to trust your neighbors. You have to trust the information you came across. So it was just an underlying theme that we felt was really, a good summary of everything we were finding. And I'll just say, each year, this is my 7th year doing this report. Coming up with the title is so challenging because you're like, how do I get 5 words that really encompass what we're talking about? And, since the beginning of this year, when we started testing doing our research process, the word trust just kept sitting in the back of my head.
Yeah, and there's nothing really new when it comes to the internet, certainly on an annual basis. Another annual report, Allie, I'm sure you're familiar with it, is the Edelman Trust Barometer. It's done by a PR firm in New York City. And every year, I know Richard Edelman, who runs his PR company, every year it seems to go down. And it's not just associated with the internet. Before we get to the digital element here, is there a crisis of trust more broadly, even outside the web, outside the net, when it comes to having faith in our political institutions, our cultural institutions, our newspapers, our education system? How would you broadly analyze what some people see as this endless crisis of trust in the 21st century?
Yeah, I would say it isn't just the digital environment, and we have a little bit in the report that actually talks about this, about how the information environment is degraded by, but also contributes to larger crisis in democracy that we're seeing, and these larger societal issues, right? Partisan attacks against confidence in our elections, the chilling effect, harassment that women are facing, and how this creates a chilling effect in their eagerness to participate in public life. Growing mistrust in the media generally, growing mistrust in your neighbors, and
except on this show, of course.
Exactly. Except on this show, we love it. No, but it is a larger crisis, and thinking through of democracy in so many countries is, has not always delivered for people. And when people don't see their political system deliver for them and their basic needs, it can raise questions around whether this is the best system for you. And, Freedom House, I oversee, our tech work, but we're a democracy organization, and we're dedicated to making clear that, democracy is the best system of governance that we have. And we've got to make sure that it delivers for people.
Yeah, it's the old Churchill quote. It's the best of the worst. It's not ideal, but it's certainly better than anything else. When it comes to the net or the internet, Allie, again, you don't need me to tell you this. One of the forms that seems to have created this crisis of trust is social media. It's disintermediation. Obviously, Facebook is an important player here, but Twitter, X, Instagram, many other platforms. How important, in terms of this crisis of trust and the freedom or lack of freedom on the net in 2024, does social media play?
It's definitely a core part of it, for both good and for bad. And it's interesting because it's very contextual based on the environment. Like I mentioned, we cover 72 countries. So we're partnering with civil society groups in really repressive environments where, even though, in that country, a particular platform has contributed to very real harms, they're still like, well, you know what? Facebook is a little bit more free, and I can engage more than I would be in a, media environment that's just totally controlled by the state. While then you have, if we're talking about in Brazil, and the ways in which, X has behaved there, we're talking about the role of, Facebook in some previous US elections, you might have a very different, certain folks might have very different feeling about what the platforms bring. So it's really interesting to see this sort of contextual side of it, and based on the larger environment of information in a country. But I would say generally, the way that I like to think about these platforms is that, they're still so fundamental for people to express themselves, and particularly for diaspora communities to reach their communities at home. We've just had so many journalists being forced into exile who are still dedicated to improving internet freedom, press freedoms in their own country, and social media platforms, for instance, are essential for that. Even when those are blocked. So thinking about a way to try to deal with some of the very serious harms on these platforms, whether it's through companies' own decision making in their own product design, or it's through just the reality of what happens on the internet that isn't, I think, one particular person to blame. So trying to think through how can we safeguard the space that it can provide for free expression, for assembly, for association, while still tackling some of those harms. And that's not an easy question. It's something that we've been grappling with for years. Other civil society groups have, regulators have. So that's sort of where we are in that debate.
Yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I was in Zurich in Switzerland, talking to an Iranian social media startup that's trying to address this whole issue of anonymity. Is anonymity the problem or the solution, Allie, to a lot of these issues of freedom of the net? On the one hand, of course, when it comes to social media, if you do away with anonymity, then we can trust everything we read because we know that it isn't a government or an interest group or some psychopath behind the poster. On the other hand, of course, if you do away with anonymity, then everyone's vulnerable to the spotlight. Everyone's vulnerable to the secret services of authoritarian regimes in China or Russia or Iran, perhaps even the United States. Where did you come down on this issue of anonymity online? Is it the problem or the solution or both?
I think it's a good question. I don't know if I would frame it as either a problem or a solution. I would frame anonymity as a very important principle for free expression online. And again, if we just think about so many places in which we operate, anonymity is the only way that people are able to engage safely and freely. And governments around the world have gone directly to undermine anonymity for the purposes of trying to tackle and close civic space. And on the question of, people who are like, oh, if we just get rid of anonymity, people will behave better. I don't know if that has been proven. I can think of a lot of powerful actors or not so powerful actors that are by no means anonymous online, and I don't see their behavior being that great. So
I can't imagine who you're thinking of.
No, I won't say anything. But so I don't think that's going to solve the problem. But what we do know is if you get rid of anonymity, it's going to lead to a lot more harms, including people thrown into prison around the world for people expressing themselves. And there's been, I'll actually flag one of our really wonderful partners that we work with. His name is Artur Pericles Lima Monteiro. He's at Yale University. He is our analyst for the Brazil country report. He has done some really awesome research around this exact question of if you restrict anonymity, does it actually help tackle misinformation? And the conclusions are not really. So there is a good body of research that I think is growing into this exact question about whether that trade-off is worth making. And our stance is no, because anonymity is essential for human rights online.
In the mid-teens, I wrote a book about some of these issues, and I spent some time in Estonia. Estonia, of course, is a pioneer of all sorts of digital innovation. I remember talking to some of the policymakers in Estonia who believed that if you could make the network within Estonia more visible, then people would behave better. I take your point on Brazil. It's an interesting subject. Maybe we should do a whole show on that. But are there countries like Estonia that are trying to make everyone online more accountable for what they do and say without making it in any way repressive or against democracy?
So it's a good question. I would say that there's been a movement within the human rights world and with rights respecting governments, this is not comprehensive, but generally, there has been a movement to understand, to deal with harms online, focus less on individual pieces of content and focus more on process and design. So what that means in more practical sense is things like the Digital Services Act, really trying to think about how to improve transparency across multiple layers of sort of, how you sort of design products versus what is the impact of certain types of speech online. So therefore, opening up platform data to independent researchers. Or if you think about like AI governance, there's been a lot of conversation about thinking through being more transparent around how AI is designed, how it's tested, how it is deployed. So focusing more on like process as well. And also the DSA does a lot on like risk mitigation. So what are the guardrails or steps you can put in place to try to limit some harms, rather than thinking about what are the penalties we can prescribe to certain people who do this. You still see some of that. And without a doubt, I think, especially within platform governance, you do need, some pretty intense fines to compel certain companies to do things. But I think getting away from like, oh, let's go after this individual user tends to be safer for human rights online, and creates these frameworks where they're less malleable based on who's in power. And that's what you want, is you want a law that's going to guard against if you have a more anti-democratic leader or government where they can't sort of use it for their own political ends. Now, that's not the case sort of in every area. There's, within copyright law, which is, I will say, is not my specialty, or within certain legal frameworks that are trying to deal with really egregious harassment, sexual violence online, you will see some of those same, penalties and civil liability. And there might be, really good reasons for that. But I would say generally within the larger platform governance, we've moved away from some of that.
Allie, 2024 has been the year of AI. I want to come to that in a minute. 2023 was more a year, it was AI, of course, but it was also a year where people talked a lot about Web3, decentralized networks, re-architecting the internet. Do you talk much in Freedom on the Net 2024 about Web3 and these, some people think it's a little bit pie in the sky, but certainly interesting sounding initiatives to decentralize not just the network, but everyone operating on it? Can Web3 help build trust, or might it actually compound the crisis of trust?
It's a great question. So it's not something we tackle directly, because what our research is trying to do is analyze what is happening right now in this particular period of time that we're looking at. And particularly because we're a project that does time series data, being very careful to pay attention to the time period is actually really important to see how these trends evolve. So because I think like Web3 and a lot of these different approaches haven't played out much in the world, it's just not coming up in the research as well. I think like generally we're in favor of the principles of decentralization, openness, inclusivity. And we sort of talk about how that might, play out in our more, I guess, the traditional issues we're looking at. But I would say, yeah, we haven't directly tackled that.
Yeah, it goes without saying you're in favor of inclusivity. Before we get to the fixes, let's go back to AI. The last report, 2023, was on the repressive power of artificial intelligence. I'm guessing that you don't think artificial intelligence in 2024 is any less potentially repressive. How central has the boom in AI, Google and obviously OpenAI and Anthropic and all these other multi-billion, sometimes trillion-dollar companies, how important is AI and the AI boom, fetish and obsession with AI, and the struggle for trust online?
So It's a great question. The way I like to think about AI within the narrow issues that we're looking at in freedom on the net, which is really, internet freedom, things online. So that's to take out things like the ways in which AI might be using in some sort of like social welfare program by a government that would be outside of our scope. I have my own opinions, but the way I like to think about it in the world of freedom on the net is really how AI is an exacerbator of the digital repression trends we've been documenting for years. And you see that within surveillance, the ways in which governments have massive data sets that is collecting location data, other personal data, maybe from internet service providers. And then they can take, facial scans they got from facial recognition, pair those together and go after protesters. You see that in censorship, how a lot of legal frameworks are requiring companies to use automated systems that more quickly flag content to be removed that, is more efficient than a human censor that might work for some ministry and some government could do. And then on the disinformation side, I mean, AI, it's long been part of the influence operations. I mean, the use of bots. For instance, Gen AI has been used to create fake profile pictures of pro-government campaigns for years now. I think the big Gen AI boom that we saw, I don't know what year did ChatGPT come out? That was 2022, November, yeah.
ChatGPT 3, I think, in 2023.
Yeah, to the public. What that did is it created the more accessible to create false and misleading information at scale, right? It didn't really do anything about distributing it. And that's what we were looking at last year is where did we already start seeing content generated by AI, whether it's text, audio, imagery, where are we already starting to see that? And this year, we really saw in all the countries that held elections that we were looking at, Gen AI was used very frequently, right? It's pervasive almost. But the question that it's not clear is how persuasive does it make influence operations? And what I feel like we're seeing thus far, and seems by a lot of my colleagues, is that Gen AI it's another tool in the toolbox for people who are creating and spreading these campaigns. And the question is, has it changed the nature of it? And we don't know. We don't know, but also like there's such a huge research gap in trying to understand this. So it might be happening, and it probably is happening more than we know. But there's a massive research gap, and I can spend days talking about some of the reasons why we have that research gap. But the one area too that we actually saw that was super interesting is how Gen AI was used in political campaigning. One of the examples I absolutely love that we detail in the report is Belarus's opposition figure. Yeah, you just pulled it up. Obviously, Belarus is
for people listening, you need to watch this in video. We have an image of a certain Belarus leader. Who is it?
He's an AI avatar. He's fake.
Right, exactly. That was your opportunity to make me look stupid.
I mean, he looks like a nice guy.
He doesn't look that nice.
Well, if he could beat Lukashenko's regime, I'll take it.
I mean, he looks better than the guy in India with the dark glasses, which isn't so.
Yes, he is dead. They made him come back to life. So the Belarus one, the opposition created an avatar and joking that he couldn't be arrested. So you did see some really interesting use cases around campaigns. We sort of talk about then, some regulatory movement around that. But it's really, I would say, just more an exacerbator of a lot of the trends and tactics we've seen, and that we're going to continue watching.
Well, enough misery, Allie. I promised not to make a joke about your last name, Funk, but I can't resist. We are getting beyond the funk to some cheerful news in the report. You have 4 principles, and as I said, it's a wonderful report. I mean, I don't quite know what your business model is at Freedom House, but you make it available for free online. Everyone should look at it. There are 4 principles, it seems, and I'm quoting the report. When adhering to these principles, governments can strengthen information integrity and safeguard internet freedom. In other words, create more trust. What are these 4 principles?
Well, first I'll say our business model, we're a nonprofit. So if any of your listeners love the work we do, want to head over to our website, Always welcome it. So what we were doing in this part of the essay, for people who have not read it, is that we tracked a lot of, because a lot of societies have faced the very real impact of what false and misleading information can have, whether it's offline violence, whether it's mistrust in democracy, whatever it is. There is a movement by so many different countries to try to tackle this problem. But it is no easy task to deal with information integrity, to protect it while also protecting free expression. It's a really hard thing to do. So we wanted to map what are some of the actions that we've seen and what are the actions that we would actually recommend. So a lot of governments are trying to work directly with tech companies to remove different types of content. Or to improve their own content moderation standards, or to actually, on Instagram or WhatsApp, have a chat bot so a voter can say, hey, where can I go vote in my polling location? So we saw a lot of these different initiatives. Not all of them ended up in actually protecting internet freedom. I could imagine, and we saw, if you're a government and you go to a tech company and you don't have anybody else in that communication, it's very easy that those demands for dealing with problematic content would very quickly slip into speech that should be protected. So we've developed out these 4 principles where if governments act in accordance with these, you're more likely to both tackle information integrity and protect internet freedom. So the first is operating with transparency. Because if you are transparent, you can build more trust, build more legitimacy in what you're trying to do. The public, you can have open debate about it because not everybody agrees on how to deal with this. Shocker. The second is with local civil society. When you have civil society involved, they can actually hold governments accountable, or companies. When they overstep, they have civil society has unique expertise they can add to the conversation. The third is operating with democratic oversight and independence. A lot of the regulators or election commissions that are trying to address this problem might be a little too cozy with an incumbent, for instance. So, making sure that the regulator or the election commission is operating independently. And then finally, adherence to international human rights standards. We think human rights law is really the best, most agreed upon universal framework that provides guidance on what type of restrictions on content might be okay, and what just,
Allie, is it you mentioned Chile earlier, is it the usual suspects when it comes to governments behaving correctly? I'm guessing the Danes, the New Zealand government, maybe Australia, Canada, are they the leaders here? Maybe Estonia?
So it honestly varies. It's really interesting. And in every country we cover, the top line is like free, partly free, not free. But if you dig into the deeper data, every country gets a score based on 21 questions. And if you dig into the deeper data, you start to see discrepancies between like even free countries. So for instance, Chile entered the index. They're 3rd this year. They're ranked with tied with Canada. Estonia's 2nd. Australia and the US are 9th, so a little bit lower.
I'm surprised the US is even in the top 10, let alone.
We don't cover every country in the world.
Sure the Australians are blushing now.
I know. Well,
who's number 1 then? Who's number 1?
Sorry?
Who's number 1?
Iceland.
Oh, well, that's no surprise.
Yeah.
So the Danes in the top 5?
We don't cover the Danes, actually.
Well,
the Netherlands,
they always, because they dominate the awards.
The Netherlands, actually, we cover them. We added them to the coverage period this year, and they came in 6th. So they did really well, 2nd in the EU after Estonia. But what I was going to say, what's so interesting about it, and the reason I like to actually bring up Chile, is Chile this past year, policymakers actually enshrined the right to encryption, which is fantastic. Encryption is something that is under attack in so many countries, including by democracies. So you see, the Five Eyes governments have not been too friendly to protecting encryption, although we don't cover all the Five Eyes, I don't think. But they're free, the ones we do cover. So you see discrepancies when you actually dig deep into the data. And I would always, I'm a nerd, I love this stuff, but would tell your listeners to go through that.
Well, it's important stuff. You spend a lot of time, as you always do, on China. But before we get to China, what about Taiwan? Is Taiwan an innovator here? How does Taiwan score? I know Audrey Tan, their think their Minister of Digital Innovation impresses a lot of people. Are the Taiwanese doing a good job when it comes to building trust? And are they a very vivid contrast with their larger neighbor?
Yes. I mean, Taiwan is really, in this year's essay, we highlight 3 really good case studies, Taiwan being one of them. Taiwan, I believe, is 6th or 6th. Yes. No, Netherlands is 6th. So Taiwan is right after them, 7th. You'll have to go on our website to get that. Yeah. They are absolutely so innovative. I think what's really interesting about Taiwan is that they face a direct attack on their democracy regularly from China, and are constantly trying to push back. And the thing that makes Taiwan such a success story is that they push back with democracy and with openness and inclusivity. And it's this openness within Taiwan itself that is what helps build trust there. So even in, they face bombardment of CCP narratives, from either, directly the Chinese state or actors that you might think are associated with the Chinese state, but it's hard to figure out specifically. But we highlight how they actually tackled that. There's this really wonderful fact-checking program and approach there called COFAX. It's an independently run project. People can directly send requests to COFAX if they see content that they're like, hey, can you fact check this for me? And COFAX is run not just by fact checkers, but just community members. So the fact that it mixes professionals, but also just everyday folks to do this work helps build trust, because then people are like, oh, these aren't just these experts. I know some of these people. So it builds this sort of community engagement side of things where people are bought into their democracy and want to protect it.
Yes, not hard to remember COFAX for baseball fans. What about China, in all seriousness? Allie, how badly do they score? You've talked about all the countries on the top of the chart. Is China at the very bottom?
China is. They have been in last place for 10 consecutive years.
Quite an achievement. Did you give them an award this year?
No, but they yelled at us about the report already. They called us baseless, which is
they? You mean the official
Chinese government?
Xi, did he?
Not Xi, but they're. I think their foreign affairs ministry or something called it baseless.
Well, that's impressive that you're registering with them.
It's an honor. But yeah, so China has been worst of the worst. I mean, just the world's most sophisticated internet controls. And what's interesting about the Chinese internet is this sort of censorship and control was built into the actual infrastructure of the internet. So that it's very comprehensive of control. And then the Chinese government has also tried to export its model abroad to other countries, to the international governance system, at the UN. So the approach is quite comprehensive there.
Africa, I'm guessing. Does China beat, so to speak, when it comes to being at the bottom? Iran and Russia, are they on your list too?
They are. So China is tied, actually, for the first year, they shared their designation the first year in a decade with Myanmar. So now China and Myanmar are at the bottom. And then Iran is the one that is the third least free. Russia's pretty down there as well, along with countries like Vietnam, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan, Belarus.
Well, it's quite an achievement that China beats Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia. Let's end on a more positive note. Building trust online. You have 10 principles outside government. We can't deal with all 10. And as I said, it's a wonderful report. It's available free. Everyone should go online, look at it, and then I think give a little donation to Freedom House. They do an excellent job. What are the most important in terms of building trust online? We've talked about the 5 principles for governments. What about tech companies? Allie, what can they be doing?
So one of the main things we highlight is, and you see this through even the government, it's transparency. It's a theme throughout. And one thing we highlight that's really concerning about the companies this past year is some of them actually rolled back mechanisms for transparency for independent researchers. So Meta and X come to mind here. Meta closed down CrowdTangle, which was a tool where researchers could analyze almost in real time different trends online, which was really important to be like, oh my God, look at all these influence ops we identified from similar actors. That tells us something really important. They replaced it with another version that is less robust. And then X put their API around just a huge paywall that is just not realistic for anybody who does this work to pay. So there's been this rollback of transparency by companies themselves, as well as governments, that we raise alarm about, because we cannot do our jobs if we do not understand what's happening within these platforms. Even like, I can't do this report, right, if I don't have an understanding of the governments that are ordering companies to remove speech or hand over data. It's just not possible. And if you don't have independent analysis of this stuff, how are you going to have informed policymaking? So that's one. And then the other one that I would just highlight that we really underscore is really needing support for civil society and local media. Freedom House, we work with over 95 civil society experts to produce this report in countries around the world. There's a huge funding challenge right now for so many of these groups. And, you can give us all the transparency you want, a company or government, but if we don't have the resources to have staff to run our organizations, for us to stay safe and to us to dig into that data, we can only do so much. So investing within civil society, and especially those on the front lines of this work, the few remaining folks in Myanmar, the people still in Venezuela that are doing this, that is one of our important call to actions, because those are the actors that are best equipped to push back against some of this stuff.
You mentioned X and Facebook. I'm guessing they're probably maybe not quite equivalent to China or Saudi or Russia, but not the best examples of tech companies, are there? Is there a Silicon Valley version of Iceland or Taiwan or Chile, examples of companies that are doing it right, who are models for other tech companies?
Well, first I would say tech companies are complicated. They're not a monolithic. So even within, Google and Meta and Amazon, I'll set X a little aside right now, you have a mix of things where you have really, people internally that deeply care about these issues and are trying to figure it out. And they do a lot of things that aren't great. But then, in certain areas, they can be partners in this fight as well. I would say the company that I really am so appreciative of is Signal, the encrypted communication app. Signal has really put their values first and made sure that, if they cannot embed their privacy by design, privacy first values within a product, they won't build that product. And that is a really just wonderful, I would urge everybody to be using Signal when you're communicating generally. It's great. Even their GIFs are encrypted, which is not an easy thing to do. So I always tell that's really, I think, a great piece.
And what about the, I don't want to talk too much about the Durov case, the Telegram case. What about the criticism from some people, particularly, of course, including security services, that when everything's encrypted, it encourages the dark web, criminality, and all the most profound online vices?
Well, encryption's, it's a protocol, so it's a trade-off, right? You're not going to have, there's very few things in life that are always perfect at all times. But what encryption also does is makes our banking system secure. It makes human rights defenders safe. It makes me be able to, not get fraudulent, somebody steal my money from my bank account. So, even though, yes, it can help facilitate some harms, and Telegram's a whole different thing. I wouldn't even connect that to encryption, because most of Telegram is actually not encrypted. And a lot of the terrible stuff happening on that platform is out in the open and has nothing to do with encryption. It has to do with a terrible content moderation and a sort of free-for-all platform. But yeah, you're going to have some of that. And we want to think about what can you do to get at the harms of the internet while still safeguarding encryption. So can you support, when you're thinking about child sexual abuse, in the ways in which child sexual abuse imagery spreads on platforms, how can we fund law enforcement to have the resources to go after some of that stuff as well? So I don't always like to just blame that on encryption. I think it's a larger ecosystem of harm that we can deal with.
And finally, Ali, we've talked about governments, tech companies. Some governments, some societies do better than others. Ultimately, we, the internet user, we're the beneficiary or the victim of all this. But what can we do as individuals? Obviously, we don't have the power of tech companies or of governments, but can individuals, I mean, they can donate, of course, to Freedom House. They should read your excellent report. But can individuals help as well in all this?
I mean, absolutely. Like we all have our own, our voices are quite powerful, even though sometimes it might not feel like that. And raising these issues to, folks that you elect, to your communities, especially like in local politics, are really important, right? Like some of the reasons that we have, encrypted now DMs on certain platforms is because users wanted it. We wanted it. So companies and governments are accountable to their people, can be when we push for it and we create democratic systems that allow for that. But we have power here. So you can elect and celebrate people or politicians that care about these issues. You can let companies know what you don't like. You can also, you have choice, hopefully, about choosing, maybe Signal, choosing the platforms that work best for your needs. But I do still think at the end of the day, the power dynamic is tilted toward governments and companies, so we can push those players.
Well, Allie Funk, co-author, Freedom on the Net 2024. Very, very important report. Wonderful summary from you. You're the Research Director for Technology and Democracy at Freedom House, as you noted. They're a non-profit, can always appreciate donations from listeners. You've done a great job, and you will continue to do. And I hope that you'll come back, or someone from Freedom House will come back in 2025. And I hope the news will be better. Thank you so much, Allie.
Thank you, Andrew.